The story of how the British Empire built global wealth begins in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, with the rise of maritime power in England and Scotland, transformation powered by technological innovation, expanding trade networks, and competition with Iberian empires. Between 1580 and 1650, English privateers such as Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh helped break the Spanish and Portuguese monopolies on Atlantic routes, capturing treasure ships and opening the way for an English merchant fleet that would dominate the seas. While the formation of chartered companies like the East India Company in 1600 established a new corporate model that combined private capital with state support, granted monopoly trading rights with the East Indies and later India, and became the engine of Britain's initial wealth accumulation by extracting spices, textiles, and later tea, opium, and other commodities. Simultaneously, the Navigation Acts of 1651 legally privileged English ships and seafarers, transforming mercantilism into enforceable policy and ensuring that wealth generated from colonial trade flowed primarily into British ports, shipyards, and banks rather than competitors' hands. This era saw the early globalization of trade. British merchants financed voyages to West Africa to exchange European goods for gold, ivory, and enslaved Africans, who were then transported across the Middle Passage to the Caribbean and North America in exchange for sugar, rum, and tobacco, commodities that became central to consumption in Europe and highly profitable on resale. By the late 1600s, the institution of plantation slavery in the Caribbean, combined with sugar production using enslaved labor, generated profits so vast that they transformed British economic structures: sugar refineries in London and Bristol, insurance underwriters in Lloyd's emerging markets, and a growing class of merchant capitalists who reinvested profits into industrial ventures. Wealth from colonies funded agricultural improvements, urban development, and the expansion of financial institutions. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, became a cornerstone of British fiscal power, managing government debt and stabilizing currency to support military expenditures and overseas expansion. While London increasingly became the financial capital of the world, these early structures laid the groundwork for a mercantile economy in which raw materials flowed toward Britain and manufactured goods flowed outward, a system that was enforced through naval dominance and diplomatic concessions. The building of global wealth during this period was not accidental, but intentional, a fusion of private ambition, state policy, and military strength that created vast trade networks and directed the flow of capital into British hands long before the industrial age truly took hold. What was the Industrial Revolution and imperial 1760 to 1850 by the mid-18th century? Roughly between 1760 and 1850, the British Empire entered the most decisive phase of wealth creation in world history through the Industrial Revolution, a transformation that did not occur in isolation but was deeply dependent on imperial resources. Colonial labor systems and global trade networks established earlier, Britain's access to cheap raw materials such as cotton from India and later the American South, sugar from the Caribbean, and metals from its colonies allowed British manufacturers to produce goods at unprecedented scale and lower cost. While colonial markets were legally forced to consume British manufactured products under imperial trade laws, creating a closed economic loop that overwhelmingly benefited Britain. The mechanization of textile production with inventions like the spinning jenny 1764, water frame 1769, and power loom 1785 turned Britain into the world's manufacturing center. The profits generated from these industries flowed directly into British banks, infrastructure, and global influence. Crucially, India played a central role in this wealth transfer. Prior to British dominance, India was one of the world's leading textile producers. But under East India Company rule after the Battle of Plassey in 1757, British authorities systematically dismantled India's local industries through taxation, tariffs, and trade restrictions, forcing India to export raw cotton while importing finished British cloth, a process historians describe as deindustrialization, which redirected enormous economic value from the Indian subcontinent to Britain, At the same time, the empire invested heavily in canals, roads, and later railways, not primarily to develop colonies, but to extract resources more efficiently, while the Royal Navy protected trade routes and suppressed rivals, ensuring uninterrupted global commerce. Britain's growing industrial output required capital, and this was supplied by profits accumulated from slavery, plantations, and colonial taxation. Recent economic research has demonstrated that wealth derived from slave labor and colonial exploitation significantly fueled early industrial investment, despite later narratives that minimized this connection. The empire also perfected financial tools during this era. Joint stock companies expanded, insurance markets matured, and London's stock exchange became a hub for global capital flows, allowing Britain to finance wars, colonization, and industrial growth simultaneously. By the early 19th century, Britain controlled roughly 1/4 of the world's industrial output, and the phrase "the workshop of the world" accurately described its economic dominance. This wealth, however, was asymmetrically distributed, while Britain prospered. Colonies faced famines, resource depletion, and economic dependency, revealing that imperial wealth was not created through mutual development, but through a hierarchical system in which productivity, profits, and power were concentrated at the center of the empire. What was the financial empire and global trade dominance from 1850 to 1914? Between 1850 and the outbreak of World War I in 1914, the British Empire reached the peak of its global wealth and power, not by territorial expansion alone, but by constructing an international financial system centered on London that controlled trade, credit, insurance, and currency flows across the world. During this period, Britain transitioned from being merely the world's largest manufacturer to becoming its primary financier, with London functioning as the clearinghouse for global capital, trade settlements, and investment. The adoption of the gold standard in the early 19th century, formalized internationally by the mid-1800s, anchored global currencies to gold reserves largely held in British-controlled banks, giving Britain immense influence over monetary stability and international trade. British banks financed railways in India, Latin America, and Africa, ports in Asia, and mines across the empire, but ownership, profits, and decision-making power remained overwhelmingly in British hands, meaning that, while infrastructure spread globally, wealth accumulation flowed back to Britain. The empire's dominance of global shipping, controlling nearly half of the world's merchant fleet by the late 19th century, ensured that goods, insurance, and logistics revenues reinforced British economic supremacy. Britain also engineered trade dependency through unequal treaties, such as those imposed on China after the Opium Wars, 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860, forcing open Chinese markets to British goods and opium imports, generating massive profits, while destabilizing local economies. Meanwhile, colonial taxation systems extracted revenue directly from colonized populations, funding imperial administration and military presence without burdening British taxpayers at home. During this era, Britain increasingly earned wealth not from production, but from rent-seeking and financial intermediation, interest payments, dividends, insurance premiums, and shipping fees, allowing it to live off the economic activity of the world while exporting relatively less. London's financial institutions set global norms, from bond markets to insurance contracts, making British law and currency standards the backbone of international commerce. By 1900, the British Empire controlled or influenced roughly 1/4 of the world's population and global trade, and the pound sterling functioned as the world's primary reserve currency, enabling Britain to borrow cheaply, finance wars, and maintain imperial control without immediate economic collapse. This system created an illusion of permanent prosperity, but beneath the surface, it depended on colonial extraction, geopolitical dominance, and financial leverage rather than sustainable domestic productivity, planting the seeds for future decline as global power structures began to shift in the early 20th century. The period between 1914 and 1945 marked the beginning of the unraveling of Britain's global wealth system as two world wars exposed the structural weaknesses of an empire built on financial dominance rather than sustained productive growth. World War I 1914 to 1918 forced Britain to abandon the gold standard, borrow heavily from the United States, and liquidate overseas assets to finance military operations, fundamentally reversing its position as the world's primary creditor, and transforming it into a major debtor for the first time in modern history. The war disrupted global trade routes, weakened British industrial capacity, and accelerated the rise of the United States as the new financial center of the world. While colonial contributions both in manpower and resources sustained Britain's war effort but deepened resentment and demands for self-rule across the empire. The interwar period failed to restore Britain's former dominance. Attempts to return to the gold standard in 1925, driven by imperial prestige rather than economic reality, overvalued the pound, damaged exports, and contributed to prolonged unemployment and stagnation at home, while the Great Depression of the 1930s further eroded trade volumes and exposed the fragility of a system dependent on global financial flows. Although imperial preference policies attempted to bind colonies more tightly to Britain, they could not reverse the long-term decline in competitiveness or productivity. World War II 1939 to 1945 delivered the final blow. Britain emerged victorious, but economically exhausted, having sold much of its remaining overseas investments, accumulated enormous debt to the United States through programs like Lend-Lease, and lost its ability to police global trade routes independently. Colonial economies, having been mobilized for wartime production, gained industrial capacity and political leverage, accelerating movements for independence. By 1945, Britain was no longer the financial anchor of the global system, the pound. Sterling was weakened. London's financial dominance had shifted to New York, and the imperial model of wealth extraction through global control had become unsustainable in a world increasingly shaped by nationalism, industrial competition, and American-led financial institutions. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the British Empire had reached its territorial peak, controlling nearly a quarter of the world's land and population. Its economic model, built over centuries of trade, conquest, and exploitation, left a profound and lasting impact on global wealth distribution. Industries established during the Industrial Revolution, textiles, coal, steel, and later railways, were not just engines of domestic British growth, but also tools to extract and reorganize resources from colonies. India, for example, became a supplier of raw cotton and a market for British-manufactured textiles, leading to the deindustrialization of local Indian industries. Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean provided minerals, sugar, and other cash crops under systems often enforced through coercion or colonial administration. The empire's global trade networks standardized currencies, shipping routes, and financial practices, laying the groundwork for modern capitalism and multinational corporations. Even after decolonization in the mid-20th century, former colonies often inherited economies designed for extraction rather than self-sustaining growth, which contributed to persistent global inequalities. London emerged as a global financial hub, where wealth extracted from colonies was reinvested into banking, insurance, and shipping, creating a cycle where capital accumulation was heavily skewed toward the imperial center. Meanwhile, global trade practices, legal systems, and infrastructure established by Britain continued to favor Western economies, accelerating industrial and technological advances in Europe and North America, while leaving many colonial regions economically dependent. Today, the legacies of the British Empire in equal wealth distribution, entrenched trade networks, and global financial dominance remain embedded in the world economy. Understanding this history clarifies how centuries of colonial practices shape not only the wealth of nations, but also the persistent structural inequalities that continue to influence global politics, economics, and development strategies into the 21st century.